Hello and welcome to another episode of Foundational Foundry, our back to basics sort of tutorial series for the Foundry for Star Trek Online. I'm Drogan1701, and with me is Green Dragoon, Mark Hawkman, and Duncan Idaho.
Hey everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Now we had a previous episode that we recorded all about Foundry downtime. But before that, if you recall, we were working on basically demonstrating your first Foundry mission, kind of start to finish. So we're going to pick up right where we left off. And Dragoon, take it away.
Okay. So when we last off, we had just kind of finished laying out our ground map. We've still got a couple of objects we need to place, but things were coming together. Now, I do want to point out one change I made. All this debris on the ship, I had made an error. I had left the relative to Y set to terrain. This was very bad of me because this means that it was following the terrain of the hill heading down, so it wasn't showing up. So during the break, I switched these over to 0 altitude and adjusted their Y value, so they're now much more visible, and it helps to...
Can you demonstrate how to change that value?
Sure. Right here, you can see by default, all objects are set to Y relative to terrain. And you have several choices, and one of them is 0 altitude, which is really nice because 0 altitude will have everything aligned to each other no matter what. So if you need for precise measurements, relative to 0 is the way to go. We also had the start of a little encounter going on here. We've got some Orions here, as well as a Starfleet ensign. Save. While I'm thinking about it, I'm going to rename her. One of those things I should have pointed out earlier is that for contacts, you do not want to leave them as default because they have they'll follow the name of their contact, which is often like Starfleet Officer Lieutenant 07.
For story reasons, that's generally a bad thing.
Yeah, it's
if you're looking at those.
A little immersion.
It sort of pulls you out of the story. Yeah.
Unless you're dealing with robots or clones.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. There's an idea for a Foundry mission right there. I'd also thrown in this invisible object, which I'm going to use later for an objective. But there's just a couple more things I think we need to lay down. And as I was looking through this before I started recording tonight, one of them is I need a door. So I've got a piece of wreckage here, which looks like a busted hallway. But eventually, at the end of this, we're going to have the player enter the ship through this broken hallway, and we need a door. They can interact with it. Got a few options. Go with
we do have quite a few options. We have doors that open, doors that are stationary. We have doors with frames on them, doors that are just the doors and no frames. And obviously available for several different types of cultures, like Klingons, Romulans, Cardassians. There's the nice Dyson Sphere door, which is a big round door.
suppose we ever got an opening for it.
That would be nice.
But for this one, I'm actually going to just use the generic door, kind of make it out like it's a hatchway you enter. So I'm going to go ahead and test this quick. I'm sure, as we've mentioned many times before, the Foundry is an awful lot of trial and error. Also, Agents of Yesterday launched since the last time we recorded.
Yeah, so we actually do have a few more things to play with in the Foundry than we had the last time we recorded an episode of Foundational Foundry.
So right here is actually a really good opportunity to talk about something else we haven't talked about yet. And that is this toolbar down here in the corner. These are the Foundry Editor's tools, and they give us access to some superpowers. Obviously, we've been doing return to editor and occasionally reset map, but we've also got a couple of other buttons here. So first one I'm going to talk about is this little drop down here in the corner. This is by default, this is set to normal, and you can run around and play as you normally would, but you've got two other settings here. You've got untargetable and God mode. Untargetable does what it think, and my boss here can demonstrate. And you see we've got these Orions around here who would normally attack me, but as long as I've got a untargetable on, they'll just ignore me. Now it's important to note that they will not ignore your bridge officers if you are untargetable. So if you are having to run through an area and you don't want to aggro all the enemies you have, you need to leave your bridge officers behind. The other setting is God mode. When I switch this on, you'll notice I've upset my Orion friends here, and they are pestering me. But you'll also notice that I am not taking any damage. This basically makes you invincible, and this can be especially useful. I mean, in a number of cases, we're often using the Foundry with a less than well-equipped captain, who is an ensign with only minimal gear. So sometimes with harder fights, it can be really challenging. But thankfully, we can switch into God mode, and they can't really do anything to me. Shoot them. Could shoot them if I even had a phaser equipped. Do something about that later. But
So your test character does not.
If I remember right, if I remember right, your freshly created test character for Foundry has no gear because they don't go through the tutorial, and the tutorial is where you actually get your starter gear.
That is a thing that has changed over the years. But yes, obviously, we just started this particular character just recently, so definitely is a bit lacking in gear.
okay, so there's one final button I should show, and that is the kill target. So I do not have what it takes to take out these thugs. I don't have a phaser, but I've got a kill target button, which, as you might guess, there we go. It takes a sec, but
One thing that's useful to remember when you're using kill target is that when there are multiple targets, you can use tab targeting to just pick a target, kill it, pick another target, and kill it.
hey, look, they dropped stuff. I got some armor. When in doubt, kill a few enemies, grab their gear, and then you won't be so terribly off. All right, so it looks like my door is needs to be pushed back a bit.
One thing you will find yourself doing as a Foundry author is a lot of moving an object a little ways, and then testing to see if it works in the 3D environment, then moving it a little bit again and testing again.
Yep.
Sometimes these moves involve long distances, sometimes it's inches. That you might
Tweaking
have to
something incessantly.
Yeah.
Part of it depends on how much of a perfectionist you are, how much you want it to look like exactly like you want it to look.
Well, I remember one specific case that caused me hours of frustration where I had decided I wanted to build a staircase on the side of a mountain, which was a rather erratic sloped structure. Well, one, I hadn't thought of using relative to 0, which would have made things easier. But also there's the fact that every single step needed to be precisely calibrated relative to the slope of the terrain, which meant pretty much recalculating everything every single time I placed an object. So, I eventually got the thing built, but took hours.
Stairs can be a pretty advanced thing to try. It's definitely something that we will detail how to do eventually. For me,
I really wish
sometimes
we had
involves
objects for those.
math.
I've got a pretty good system on that. So I take a floor piece or some other block that I've set level to the walking area, and then I take an identical version of that and move it up either 0.2 or 0.3 units of Y. And just keep copying that, repeating. And I can get a stairway now done pretty much without too much trial and error in about 10 minutes altogether. So there are ways of simplifying the process, but they do require that you use 0 altitude. Because if you try to do it on terrain, then you are having to recalculate every single time. But if you just do 0 altitude, then you can basically just use the coordinate system and a little bit of logic and just kind of keep you moving up that small increment.
Well, I mean, for any reference that people are, I have found that a good step size is about 0.3. So an increment of 0.3 is enough for a player to walk up.
It's very important to remember that when you're making your own custom steps, that if the steps are too high, the player will have to jump to go up the steps. This is undesirable.
Yeah, definitely happens at 0.5. I think it also happens on 0.4. 0.3 is the limit, but 0.2 can also look. It also has its benefits if you want something that looks a little bit more decorative and shallow.
Well, one thing I've noticed from Dyson Battle Zone runs is that there are certain places on the ramps in the Dyson Ground Battle Zone where it doesn't look like there's an obstruction there, but if you try to just walk over it, you can't.
So, yeah, I think that's close enough for this.
Yeah,
obviously, it's a crashed ship. It doesn't need to be perfect.
If it's out of place, it's just been torn out.
Yeah.
By the tremendous force of the impact.
That gives us an object to. That gives us an object to use as an entry point.
Transition from this ground map to an interior map, which is going to be our next one. We will need a point of entry.
All right, before we move on, though, we've actually got to place some objectives because
yes,
get a big fat. All right, so this is our second map, and we need to pick some mission text for it. Now, unlike previous entries, we don't need this to name this specifically for like location or anything like that, like we do with the first one. So I'm kind of curious, in non-first maps, what do you guys like to put for mission text?
Chapter titles.
Okay.
Most of them, but for the very first one. Oh, you're saying not non-first one?
Yeah, not the first one.
Yeah, I like to, I don't know, come up with a chapter title of some sort.
Okay, so what shall we call
I usually,
this?
I usually steal from song titles or lyrics.
I'm not very good at song titles. I'll have to come up with something else. How about just rough landing?
Yeah, that sounds good. I was trying to think of making a pun on the Orions, and unfortunately, I can't get one right now. I could do it if we were using Gorn, but no.
Gorn are easy. Everybody can
Yeah.
pun Gorn. Okay, well let's plot out exactly what's happening on this ground map. I'm thinking we'll start out with some dialogue from one of the bridge officers. We're going to follow up with an interact object where an interact object where we scan the area to locate the crash. Do a nice little tricorder scan animation. I think we'll follow it with a reach marker to around the crash site, so we know when the player approaches the crash site. After that, I think we will. After that, we'll have to engage the Orions, who are holding the crewmen. What's a Starfleet way to say eliminate?
Overcome.
Neutralize.
Yeah, neutralize is a good one.
No, you just don't want, as a Starfleet officer, you just don't want to go around saying to kill people, but you need to come up with other ways to say
Exterminate them.
Yeah, defeat is usually what I go for a general, non-specific way of making things go away. Overcome if I want it to sound aspirational.
Okay. All right, so after they defeat the Orions, we need to talk to the crewmen. Then finally, to the ship. I think in most cases when people, I mean, that's a good question though, is do you guys tend to plot out the objectives ahead of time, or do you tend to add them in after, or do you just kind of do a mix where you're like build a little, add in an objective, build a little, add an objective?
I tend to have at least planned out of what I need the player to do on that map before I go in. Sometimes I will find that I need to add objectives that I didn't know I needed as the process goes on.
Generally,
I try to at least plan out a basic idea, because just making up everything as I go along just usually doesn't work out. I usually end up making up too much stuff as it goes along anyways.
I generally do bit of map building, bit of dialogue writing, And if that's associated with an objective, I'll definitely have that on there. But generally, when I do most of the objective scripting, that's midway to the latter part of the mission build. So not the very, very, very last thing typically, but it sort of starts up when everything else is taking shape. So I know what space I have, where I'll be putting enemy units down, how many would really work well for a given space.
As I know, as we've been building up to this, I've been dropping down a lot of objects that are going to be used for these objectives. But obviously, I mean, for some people, it may be a case where they know all this in advance, they figure it out as they're building it, or they come back through and hook everything up once everything's built. Okay, so I just got a bit of text here for when we beam down. Just kind of nudging the player to do a scan of the area, which will be formed. So at the very end of last week's episode, yeah, I placed this invisible object and said that's for later. This is when it's for. It's basically an interactable object that the player can't see, so it just shows up as a button and allows them to carry out this interaction of scanning.
And that's generally useful for whenever you need the player to do some type of animation or perform some specific type of task that's not associated with something in the environment. So transporting, if you've got a map transition, kind of planned out in a more complicated way than is customary just by changing the physical maps. Let's see, some like shouting, waving, and also falling down. I think I've used that once. But
So
yeah, it's a very useful thing.
I should point out real quick, we have 2 tricorder scans. One of them is Klingon, one of them is Federation. And right now there is really no way to tell which is which. So it's something we'll want to check later when we test. But just be aware that that's a thing that you may or may not have to come back and change.
Or
repeatedly.
You can use the sustained animation.
Yeah, I want to say that it's not. There's some animation quirks. Not quite meant to be something that's pulled out.
It kind of works, and yeah, that's generally what I kind of go for, just because I don't really have to think about it. Although I do end up spending plenty of time going back and looking at other things.
All right, so I got a reach marker here. This is going to be my detector for when as the player approaches the crash ship. Hoping that's far enough out that it out of the range of the Orions. It should be. I think that should be fine. Back to my story. I'm going to hook that up to the locate crash site objective. All right, so once they reach that reach marker and they are within sight of the Orions, we're going to have one of the our bridge officers react to the situation. Tactical officer seems appropriate here.
I'd go with the phrase, "Oi, let's get them."
Well, I'm not entirely sure that
it's not in the traditional Starfleet lingo, but
yeah, and
I think it's funny.
What if the player's bridge officer is from Wyoming?
It's just going to be a different inflection on "oi." I think that like just the whole like Starfleet officers shouting, "Let's get him." I think that's kind of more the key problem. But that's the subverting of expectations. Definitely, you got to learn how to do things the appropriate way, then you can just do something completely different if you feel like, hey, I think this will have a good effect. So generally, you do want to stick to something simple, especially for this type of pop-up. You don't want the player reading large amounts of text before they're getting into a battle, when you can basically just let the fact that there's a bunch of Orions there do a lot of the storytelling for you. So something quick, simple, easy to pop up, really hits that point of like, hey, we've seen something surprising here, let's go do something about it.
Yeah, like we've said several times in the past, stereotypes exist as a way of categorizing things. They're not inherently good or bad.
You'll notice that in a lot of these dialogues, I'm adding a instruction surrounded by the mission info text. This is just kind of a nice reminder to the player to kind of keep things on track. Make sure that they don't get confused.
And you can definitely leave that as sort of this kind of a standalone thing if you do that consistently, where a player will see green text and say, oh, that's not this officer talking, that's just a bit of direction.
Yeah, and that's
But
generally how Cryptic uses it.
Or you can do what I do, and I actually integrate it all into the font. So I'll actually have basically used as a highlighter. So if I'm giving a mission objective in conversation, that's the sort of the maximum level of emphasis I put on it. If I want to put a little bit of emphasis on it, I use out of character. So you can definitely feel creative with your use of that font, even just getting a little artistic if you want to make a computer display screen look like a little bit more of a display rather than just more text as you would see from a spoken dialogue with a bridge officer, for example.
But when in doubt, it's always best to kind of look at what Cryptic does, because
Yeah.
it's certainly what the players will expect.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's also an easy reference to go to, since it's in the game, it's the same format.
I mean, that said, but I mean, that's not to say
Roughly.
that there aren't occasionally instances where you need to deviate from the mold, or when deviating from the mold can help advance your story. I know. Yeah, I had one instance where I had the player's bridge officers taken over by aliens, and so I intentionally really wrote them out of character to try to emphasize that they were not themselves. I mean, even breaking the rules can be used to your advantage.
I think the worst thing I've done to a bridge officer so far has been just to suggest that officer learned English as a hobby because they weren't able to pick up the trombone. That's as far as I've gotten. And in dialogue, it works a little bit better because there's a few options that help tailor that response a little bit. So you're only up to the point of like really questioning what's going on if you've sort of hinted that this particular officer's an alien, because otherwise it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, there's like the one suggestion I just have is, definitely try to stick with something that people will go with, that people won't actively start rebelling against in the middle of a mission, because then it just takes them out there thinking, why are you doing this? I don't agree with it, and so on and so forth. But you do want to have a little something in there that sort of stands out, something that's going to help that player see that, you know what, this is something that I'm enjoying playing because it's having an impression. And for a lot of stuff, you can get by going through the default, by going through the expectation. But there is going to come a time where you're going to have to do something a little creative for the mission to really sort of stand out as something other than a really straight run patrol. More like the exploration sector stuff that used to be in the game a while ago, versus some of the Delta Rising patrols, which always have this little bit of a foil, this little aspect to it that sort of helps that mission stand out a little bit.
Yeah, there's a big difference between doing a mission where you beam down to a planet to do a mineral survey and you get attacked, and then after you get rid of the attackers, you're done. That's kind of boring because, I mean, you don't have a story about why the attackers are there. So, what's the best way to put this? The attackers are just, I guess you could say, temporary distraction, and they're not really part of the story. Versus a situation like you were saying with the Delta Rising patrols, where the presence of the attackers is integral to the story.
Yeah, because even if that story isn't very big, there's something going on. There's the cooperative shifts they're trying to repair, but they've got attacked by Vodwar in the middle of Solar Storm. You're trying to mediate a exchange of medical supplies between, say, Talaxians and Hazari. There's a little something there, even if it ultimately does still boil down to text, shooting people. Text, there's more of a human reaction that you can have when you've put a little bit of something there. Overall, it still fits with a format, but it's definitely you definitely want to put some thought into like why should a player play my particular mission versus just going and doing a patrol.
Well, for example, I mean, there's this simple stuff like explaining why this specific enemy faction has chosen to antagonize you. I mean, like with the Orions, you know, there's a whole bunch of, I guess you could say, expected things where, you know, it's something that seems obvious. I mean, like Orions are a lot of time they'll do their piracy routine because they're just there because they're being greedy people like usual. Pretty simple, but that's not the only thing Orions ever do.
Sorry, I've been writing dialogue as you guys have been talking.
How many references to potatoes do you have?
Not enough.
I still am up to only, let's see, I'm up to 1 still through all my 10 missions. Still working on it though.
Basically writing the dialogue where the captured crewman you save explains the situation.
Fell out of the ship when it crash landed, and then there were a bunch of green guys around me. I'm scared and hungry.
Pretty much. Do you have a potato? So just a note here, I did add a dialogue choice here where you can choose to either be more concerned about the Orions or more concerned about saving the crew. Doesn't really affect anything, but
yeah, dialogue options can be a very good thing. It's also worth remembering that through dialogue options, you can copy and paste. Since so if you want, say, the first part to vary a little bit for someone's reaction to you, but still eventually get to the same mission point, you can Control-C, Control-V, copy-paste, get the text easily at that way. So you're able to populate the sections of, say, 2 branching paths that you want to have something in common with. Or you can do something completely different. This is where you can get some pretty creative options. Also considering the fact that you can also supply leading questions that sort of flush out other aspects of the mission, but aren't necessarily integral to the plot. So you can have, like what we're doing here, is making two equal choices. But you can have, say, the choice on the right. You can drag that little arrow right at the bottom into the choice on the left, which means that once you're done that option, you forward on to the main path. So you basically create a smaller loop, something that allows players to go out a little bit, get a little bit more information, have that one more option, and then come back to the rest of the plot. So, and there's a lot of things that you can do. Like you can even have like elaborate conversations where you're able to ask someone like 3 questions, all of which leads to, the same, just an informative response. And then that triggers a secondary reaction, which is like that character asking you, do you want to know any more questions? Which either allows you to continue on or sends you right back to the top of the menu so they can ask one of the other questions that you've supplied in that. So you can go really far with those.
I've just going to say I've added in this last interact objective, which is going to be the interact with that door that we spent so much time placing just so. And that's going to allow us to use that as a way into the ship. All right, that's about all the time we have for this episode. We've managed to get everything in place on the ground, and we've started plotting out our sequence of events in the story tab. Next week, we'll be finishing off this map and giving it a good playtest. And after that, we'll be done here, and then we'll be moving on to the starship interior. So stay tuned. For tonight, though, we will bid you farewell.
Good night.
Good night.
Night good.